thought we were just having a quiet Sunday dinner when my mother-in-law slid a folded piece of paper across the table and said those words, "Sell the apartment, dear. You don't need it anymore. You live here now." I smiled politely and said nothing. What I didn't know was that by the time I got home that evening, the paperwork to transfer ownership of that apartment had already been prepared, signed in my name by someone else, and was sitting in a manila envelope inside my husband's desk drawer. That detail, the manila envelope, is what I keep coming back to. Not the betrayal itself, not even the money, the envelope. Because it means they had been planning this for months, while I was cooking dinners and paying the mortgage and believing with the whole foolish weight of my heart that I was part of a family. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is Jane, I'm 34 years old, and I own, or I thought I owned, a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a quiet building in a neighborhood I chose myself, paid for myself, and spent 2 years making into something I was proud of. I bought it at 29, before I met Daniel, before the wedding, before his mother Carol became a permanent fixture in the architecture of my life. The down payment came from 5 years of careful saving, from skipped vacations and packed lunches and saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to something permanent. That apartment was the first real thing I had ever owned outright, the first proof I had given myself that I could build something that belonged to me. When Daniel and I got married 3 years ago, we moved into his house, a larger place he'd inherited from his father, with a yard and a guest room that Carol used whenever she visited, which was often. We agreed that I would keep the apartment and rent it out. It made financial sense. The rental income covered the mortgage payments, and we treated it as an investment, a cushion, something for the future. Daniel had always nodded along when I talked about it. He'd said things like, "Smart thinking," and "That's your security, Janie," with such genuine warmth that I had never once questioned whether he meant it. Carol was another story. She had a way of circling the topic of the apartment the way a cat circles something it wants, but hasn't decided to touch yet. The comments were always small at first, packaged in concern. "Isn't it a lot of work, managing a rental property on top of everything else?" she'd say, tilting her head with that practiced look of gentle worry. "Daniel tells me the tenants were late again this month. That must be so stressful, sweetheart." And I would say it was fine, that I had a property manager, that it wasn't really a burden. She would nod slowly, as if she had registered my answer but found it unconvincing. She was a tall woman, Carol, with silver hair she kept in a rigid helmet of a style, and a wardrobe composed entirely of structured blazers in neutral tones. She smelled of a particular powdery perfume that I came to associate with a low, persistent unease, the kind that lives in your chest and doesn't announce itself until something actually goes wrong. She was not cruel in the ways you might expect. She didn't raise her voice or make obvious demands. Her weapon was something quieter and more corrosive, the implication, the lifted eyebrow, the pause that lasted just a half-second too long before she agreed with something you had said. The first moment I can point to, looking back, was a Sunday in late October of last year. Daniel and I had been married for just over 2 years. Carol had come for the weekend, as she often did, and we were sitting in the kitchen after breakfast, the good kind of autumn morning, where the light comes in flat and golden through the windows and everything feels temporarily unhurried. Carol was holding her coffee cup with both hands, looking out at the yard, and she said without turning to look at either of us, "I saw that the Hargrove place on Elm sold for a remarkable price last month. The market is really extraordinary right now." I said something neutral, something about how it depended on the neighborhood. She turned then and looked at me with that particular expression of hers, warm on the surface, calculating underneath. "Your apartment must be worth quite a lot more than you paid for it, Jane. Have you thought about what you'd do with the money? If you sold, I mean, just as an option." I said I hadn't thought about selling, that it was an investment. She nodded, smiled, and let it go. And I let myself believe that it was just conversation. But it wasn't just conversation. I understand that now. It was reconnaissance. Over the next several months, the subject came up again and again, always in that same casual, almost accidental way. At Christmas dinner, when Carol mentioned that Daniel's cousin had just bought a larger house. Of course, it's easier when you're not managing other properties on the side. At a birthday lunch for Daniel's aunt, when someone asked about the rental market. Jane has a lovely apartment she rents out, though I've always wondered if it's really worth the complication. Each time I deflected. Each time, Daniel said nothing. He would reach for more bread, refill his glass, look at a point somewhere between me and his mother, with an expression I had learned to read as, "Please don't make this a thing." I should have made it a thing. I know that now. The real shift came in February, about 8 months ago. Carol had started calling Daniel more frequently. I noticed this the way you notice something without fully registering it, the way you hear a faint sound in the walls and tell yourself it's just the house settling. He would take the calls in the other room, which he had always done, because he said his mother was a talker, and he didn't want to subject me to the full length of her monologues. I had found this considerate rather than suspicious. I was, I now understand, catastrophically trusting. One evening in March, I came home from work earlier than expected. I work in pharmaceutical sales, which means my schedule is erratic. Some days I'm out until 7, some days I'm done by 3, and home before Daniel has even started thinking about dinner. That particular day, I had finished 2 calls ahead of schedule and come home to find Daniel sitting at his desk in the small room off the hallway that he used as a home office, his back to the door, the phone pressed hard against his ear. He hadn't heard me come in. The house was quiet except for his voice, low and careful, saying, "She doesn't need to know about that part yet. Just make sure the valuation is ready before the Sunday visit." I stood in the hallway for a moment. The words arranged themselves in my mind without meaning anything concrete. She doesn't need to know. The valuation. I told myself he was probably talking about a work thing. He sold commercial insurance. There were always valuations, always deals in progress, always some layer of the transaction that the other party didn't need to see until the right moment. I told myself this with such efficiency that I had almost convinced myself before I'd even taken off my coat. I went to the kitchen and made noise with the kettle. By the time Daniel appeared in the doorway, I was pouring water over a tea bag and looking out the window at the neighbor's oak tree, and everything about me communicated that I had just arrived, that I had heard nothing, that I was entirely untroubled. "You're home early," he said. His voice was easy, warm, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. "Call's finished up," I said. "You hungry?" He kissed the top of my head and said he'd make pasta, and we spent the evening the way we spent most evenings, eating at the kitchen table, talking about small things, watching something on television afterward. I looked at him across the couch and thought, I am imagining things. This is a good man. This is my husband. I was so committed to that story that I almost didn't open the desk drawer 3 weeks later. I had gone into his office to find a stamp. That's all. A mundane errand in my own house. I needed to mail something to my insurance company. I'd looked in all the usual places, and I remembered that Daniel kept a strip of stamps in the shallow drawer of his desk. I pulled it open. The stamps were there, tucked under a pen and a small notepad. So was a manila envelope, letter-sized, unsealed, with my name written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. I picked it up the way you pick up something you already know is dangerous, with that particular mix of dread and compulsion that doesn't leave you any real choice. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a property valuation for my apartment, professional, stamped, dated 6 weeks earlier, showing a current market value roughly 40% above what I had paid. The second was what appeared to be a preliminary sale agreement, typed and formatted, with a buyer's name I didn't recognize and a sale price just below the valuation. The third was a transfer of authorization form, a legal document granting Daniel the authority to act on my behalf in property transactions. And at the bottom, on the line marked property owner's signature, was my signature. Except I had never signed it. I sat down on the edge of Daniel's desk chair because my legs had simply stopped cooperating with the rest of me. The paper in my hand felt very heavy for how thin it was. I read the signature again. It was a good copy, close enough that at first glance it would have fooled me, close enough that it would probably fool a bank clerk who wasn't looking closely. But I know my own handwriting. I know the way the J in Jane sits slightly lower than it should, the way I loop the D in my last name. This signature had the right general shape, but it was smoother, more even, produced by someone copying carefully rather than someone writing habitually. My heart was doing something irregular against my ribs. The room was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen, the sound of a car passing outside. I sat there for what might have been 4 minutes or 14, I genuinely cannot say, just staring at 3 pieces of paper that were trying to tell me something I did not want to understand. Then I put them back exactly as I had found them, took my stamp, and closed the drawer. I put the stamp on my envelope, sealed it, and drove to the post office. I remember sitting in the car afterward in the parking lot, engine running, watching a woman load groceries into her trunk with the methodical efficiency of someone whose afternoon contained no particular crisis. And I thought, I could be wrong. There are innocent explanations. Maybe Daniel found documents that needed to be stored. Maybe the signature was a draft, a template, something that didn't mean what it appeared to mean. I gave myself those 20 minutes in that parking lot to believe the innocent explanations. And then I drove home and began quietly, carefully, to dismantle them. That evening, while Daniel was in the shower, I went back to the desk. I photographed all 3 documents with my phone: the valuation, the sale agreement, the forged authorization form. Then I placed them back exactly as I had found them, sat down at the kitchen table, and called my father. He lives 40 minutes away, a retired accountant with a dry, methodical mind that has never in my lifetime been fooled by anything anyone tried to pass off as something it wasn't. I told him everything in a low, careful voice, watching the hallway for Daniel's shadow. My father listened without interrupting, which is his way. When I finished, there was a pause, and then he said, "Don't touch anything else. Don't confront anyone. Come to me tomorrow morning and bring the photographs." My father looked at the images for a long time, his reading glasses low on his nose, the kitchen table between us covered in the morning's detritus, a coffee cup, yesterday's newspaper, the comfortable disorder of a man who lives alone and answers to no one. Then he looked up and said, "The authorization form is a forgery. The structure of the document is standard, but the notarial stamp in the corner, look here. The date on the stamp is 3 weeks before the form itself was supposedly signed. Someone assembled this in a hurry, or they didn't think anyone would look closely." He took off his glasses and set them down. "You need a solicitor. Today, not tomorrow." I drove to a solicitor's office that same afternoon, a woman named Patricia, who my father had used years ago and trusted entirely. I sat across from her desk and laid out the photographs and told the story in the same careful, low voice I had used with my father. And I watched her expression do what trained professional faces do, remain neutral on the surface while something much sharper moved underneath. She asked me several precise questions. Was I on the property deed? Had I signed any documents relating to the apartment in the past 18 months? Had Daniel ever had power of attorney over any of my assets? No, no, and no. She made notes on a yellow pad and then sat back and said, "What you're describing, if it proceeds, would constitute fraud. The forged signature alone is a criminal matter. But before we go further, you need to know the full picture. Is there anything else you haven't told me?" I told her about the phone call I had half heard in March, about the Sunday dinners and Carol's circling questions, about the way Daniel's behavior had shifted subtly over the winter, the closed-door phone calls, the new habit of checking his email in the other room. Patricia nodded slowly at each detail, writing. Then she said something that rearranged the furniture of everything I thought I understood. "Has it occurred to you," she said, "to find out who the buyer is in that sale agreement?" It had not occurred to me. I had been so focused on the forgery, on Daniel's involvement, on the physical fact of my signature on a document I had never signed, that I had not looked at the buyer's name carefully enough. I opened the photograph on my phone and enlarged it. The buyer was listed as a numbered holding company. Patricia was already typing. 40 seconds later, she turned her screen toward me and said, "That company was registered 11 months ago. Its sole director is a woman named Carol Ann Marsh." The room went very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from too much understanding arriving at once. Carol. The buyer was Carol. My mother-in-law had arranged to purchase my apartment, forging my signature on the authorization, probably with Daniel's knowledge and almost certainly with his cooperation, at a price just below market value, through a shell company that bore no obvious connection to her name. She had been planning this, I now understood, not for months, for years. Every casual question about the rental market, every sympathetic comment about the stress of managing a property, every "just sell it, dear, simplify your life," had been reconnaissance for a transaction she intended to execute whether I agreed to it or not. I sat in Patricia's office for another hour. When I left, I had a clear set of instructions and a new, cold kind of clarity that felt nothing like anger and everything like resolve. Anger is hot and disorganized. What I felt walking back to my car was neither of those things. It was precise. It was architectural. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and I knew exactly in what order. I drove home. Daniel was in the kitchen when I arrived, standing at the counter with a glass of water, looking at his phone. He looked up and smiled. I looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at something when you already know the verdict. And I thought, he practiced that smile. He has been practicing it for a year. "Hi," I said. "Can we sit down?" His smile flickered, just slightly, the way a light flickers before the power goes out. "Sure," he said. "Everything okay?" I sat down at the kitchen table. I placed my phone face up between us. On the screen was the photograph of the authorization form, enlarged to the signature line. I watched his eyes move to it. I watched the color leave his face in a slow, unmistakable recession, like a tide going out. "I found it 3 days ago," I said. My voice was steady. "I've spoken to a solicitor. I know about your mother's company." I paused. "I'd like you to explain it to me. Start wherever you want, but don't lie to me again, because I already know most of it." He sat down across from me. He said nothing for a long moment, looking at the table, and in that silence I heard every dinner we had eaten at this table, every morning, every ordinary evening when I had looked at this man and believed in the life we were building. Then he said, very quietly, "She asked me to help her. She said it would just be an investment, that you'd get fair value for it, that it would simplify everything. She forged my signature, Daniel." "I didn't know she was going to do that." He looked up. "I swear to you, I didn't know about the signature." "But you knew about the company. You knew she was planning to buy it." The pause was a fraction too long. "Yes," he said, "I knew." Something in me that had been waiting to break simply didn't. It had already broken, 3 days ago in that parking lot, and what was left now was something harder, less easily damaged. I said, "You knew she was planning to acquire my property without my knowledge, and you said nothing. You let me sit at her dinner table and smile and pass her the bread while she was running this scheme with your help." "Jane, she asked you," I said, "and you chose her. You have been choosing her, quietly, consistently, for the entire time we have been married. You let her run her commentary about my apartment at every family dinner, and you said nothing. You took her calls in the other room, and you said nothing. You saw documents being prepared in my name, and you said nothing." I stood up. "That's not a mistake. That's a decision. You made it over and over again." He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked for the first time like someone who genuinely had no defense, because there wasn't one. There was nothing he could say that would reconstruct what had just been permanently dismantled at that kitchen table. "I'm going to stay at my father's," I said. "Patricia is filing the fraud report tomorrow morning. The police will likely want to speak to you and your mother within the week. I'd recommend you get your own solicitor." I packed a bag in 20 minutes. Daniel stood in the bedroom doorway while I did it, making the kind of broken, inadequate statements that people make when they understand they have destroyed something irreplaceable. "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would go this far. I love you." I didn't respond to any of them. There was nothing to respond to. Love and betrayal had apparently been able to exist in the same man at the same time, and that fact, more than the forgery, more than the company, more than any single discovery, was the thing that I would spend the next several months learning to hold. Carol, it turned out, had underestimated Patricia with the same confidence she had underestimated me. Patricia moved quickly. The forged authorization was submitted to a handwriting analyst who produced a formal report within 5 days, confirming it was not my signature. The police opened an investigation. The sale, which had apparently been scheduled to go to final contract within 3 weeks of when I found the envelope, never progressed. Carol's holding company was flagged and frozen. And Carol herself, confronted at her home by 2 officers with the relevant documentation, did what she had always done when genuinely cornered. She produced tears. I was not there to see it. My father told me about it afterward, matter-of-factly, the way he tells me most things. He had spoken to a mutual acquaintance who lived on Carol's street. She had apparently stood in her doorway, in her structured blazer, weeping in a way that was indistinguishable from her dinner table expressions of wounded concern, insisting that there had been a misunderstanding, that she had only been trying to help, that Jane had always been difficult and emotional and had clearly blown this completely out of proportion. One of the officers, according to the acquaintance, had waited until she finished and then very calmly asked her to explain the discrepancy in the notarial stamp date. She had stopped crying immediately. There was, the acquaintance reported, a very long silence. The fraud charge stood. The criminal process moved on its own timetable, slow and methodical, and utterly indifferent to Carol's feelings about it. Daniel, to his credit, did not attempt to protect her from it. He provided a full statement to the police, admitted his knowledge of the scheme, and accepted the consequences of that admission, which included, ultimately, his own formal caution for failing to report a known fraud in progress. It did not make him a villain in the legal sense. It did not make him innocent in any other. We did not divorce immediately. That surprises people when I tell them, though I'm not sure it surprises me. The dissolution of a marriage, unlike the discovery of its betrayal, is not a single moment. It is a long series of smaller moments, each one a small door closing quietly. We tried, for about 6 weeks, to have the conversations that people try to have, the ones about trust and repair and whether 2 people can find their way back to each other after something structural has been broken. We sat in a therapist's office and said true things to each other, and the true things were painful, and in the end, the truest thing of all was that what Daniel had done was not an impulsive mistake. It was a pattern. A long, well-established pattern of choosing his mother's agenda over my safety. I could forgive him in the complicated, imperfect way that people forgive things that have nonetheless changed them permanently. I could not rebuild a marriage on the same foundation that had already failed. The papers were filed 4 months after I found the envelope. I moved back into my apartment in the spring. It looked the same rooms, same light through the same windows, same 4th-floor view of the same quiet neighborhood, and it felt entirely different in the best possible way. The tenants had moved out the previous December, which meant the apartment was empty when I returned, and I spent 2 weeks relearning its particular sounds and rhythms and the exact quality of the morning light in the kitchen, which I had missed without knowing it. My father came to help me move boxes, and at one point, I found him standing in the living room window, looking out at the street below, his hands in his jacket pockets, and he said, without turning around, "You know, when you called me that night, I thought to myself, she's going to be all right. She called me instead of confronting anyone. She thought first." He paused. "That's the thing I've always admired about you. You think first." I didn't say anything. I set down the box I was carrying and went to stand beside him at the window, and we looked out at the street together for a moment. The ordinary afternoon traffic, a woman walking a dog, a delivery van double parked outside the bakery on the corner. And I felt, for the first time in what had been a very long year, something that was simply and uncomplicated peace. The legal case against Carol concluded 8 months later with a suspended sentence and a fine that was, frankly, smaller than it should have been. The law, as Patricia had warned me from the beginning, is more interested in procedure than in justice, and the two are not always the same thing. Carol did not apologize. I did not expect her to. People who believe themselves to be the protagonists of their own story rarely apologize for the plot choices they make on behalf of other characters. What I got instead was simpler and, in the end, more durable. I kept my apartment. I kept the thing I had saved for and chosen and built, the first real proof I had ever given myself that I could construct something permanent. Carol had wanted it, schemed for it, forged documents to obtain it, and she got none of it. There is a particular satisfaction in that outcome that I have found to be, if not exactly warm, then solid, something you can put your weight on. Some evenings now I sit on the small balcony with a glass of wine and listen to the city doing its usual evening things. The distant traffic, the neighbors' wind chimes, the particular quality of dusk in a neighborhood you chose yourself. And I think about the word yours. How small it sounds, how much it contains. This apartment is mine. It has always been mine. And that, in the end, was never really Carol's decision to make.